Good morning and welcome to this symposium, Extraction in the Era of Global Change. I am Darren Wines, and I will be facilitating this event. Before our keynote speaker begins, I just wanted to provide an introduction to the organizer of this event, Pegasus Institute, and why we organize this event. I would also like to formally acknowledge that where I work is located in the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. Although we have attendees from many areas of the world, I think it's important to recognize the Indigenous peoples that have cared for this land, now called Canada, since time immemorial. I invite everyone to also reflect where they live and work and the history of that land and its Indigenous peoples. Pegasus Institute is an acronym built from the first letters of our main themes: peace, global health, and sustainability. Pegasus Institute was developed from a series of biannual conferences that took place from 2012 to 2018, seeking to address global health challenges through a lens of peace and sustainability. After becoming a nonprofit organization and now registered charity, the Institute's programming has expanded to include a number of research projects, service delivery programs, publications, knowledge sharing activities, collaborations, and networks, including the Emerging Leaders Network, the Latin American Network, the Francophone Network, and soon to be launched East African Network. These networks, comprised of professionals and students from across the world, engage in webinars, research activities, and collaborative projects. So why this symposium? We believe that discussing issues of resource extraction in a world where climate change impacts are increasingly affecting our health, environment, and communities is more pertinent than ever. As global leaders aim to mitigate climate change through transitions to greener energy, we will see a higher demand for extraction of resources to meet this demand. This creates a host of questions we want to look at today, such as what impacts has this had and will this have on health, on our environment, and on Indigenous communities? What is being done to reduce these negative impacts? Is it possible to meet these mitigation targets in a way that promotes equity and sustainability? Finally, we believe this is a relevant conversation because millions of people across the world have been raising their voice on these issues in a number of groundbreaking protests and movements. One example being recent nationwide protests that took place in the fall 2023 in the country of Panama against an open pit copper mine that resulted in the closure of the mine. These are clearly issues that will not go away, and it is our responsibility to think through them critically and with an open mind. Now, a brief overview of today's run of show and agenda. We have our morning session, which will look into extraction from a more social, political, and environmental lens, followed by our midday session, which will have more of a focus on health and the community, especially Indigenous communities. The morning and midday session will be both followed by a time of interaction, discussion, and Q&A. If you do not feel comfortable raising a hand to ask a question verbally, you may enter your question to the chat, which will be monitored by one of my colleagues. If you want more information about Pegasus Institute, please feel free to visit our website or send us an email if you're interested in joining one of our 4 networks. Without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Gabrielle Slowey. Dr. Gabrielle Slowey is an associate professor in the Department of Politics at York University and is a member of the graduate programs in Politics and Socio-Legal Studies. She is also the former director of the Roberts Center for Canadian Studies at York from 2015 to 2021. She was the inaugural Fulbright Chair in Arctic Studies at Dartmouth College in the United States and a York Massey Fellow. Her research focuses on the political economy of land claims, treaties, and self-government, especially across the Northern Arctic and in areas where resource extraction takes place. Her work considers questions of community health, environmental security, climate change, and Indigenous rights in these contexts. Her approach is very much community-based and community-driven research. It draws upon broader theoretical concerns of colonialism, reconciliation, staples, and democracy. In 2018, she was co-PI on a SSHRC Indigenous Research Capacity and Reconciliation Connection grant for a project titled Spirit and Intent, the Yukon Umbrella final agreement today and tomorrow, supporting the transfer of knowledge and promoting an understanding of what the agreements mean to improve future government opportunities and relationships. She is the author of numerous publications, including Navigating Neoliberalism, Self-Determination, and the Mikisew Cree First Nation. You may now share your screen, Dr. Slowey. We look forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. I'm Dr. Gabrielle Slowey from the Department of Politics at York University here in Toronto. Hope you're having a nice Friday morning wherever you are and you have a good cup of coffee in your hand and are sitting somewhere comfortable and ready for this very stimulating and exciting morning of conversation that the Pegasus Institute has organized for you. I know I'm looking forward to hearing some of the panelists myself. Unfortunately, I have a hard out at 11:30, but I will stay till then and hopefully have a chance to answer some questions. So without further ado, I'm just going to organize the screen here so that I can share with you my presentation for this morning. So let me share my screen, pulling up my old COVID skills, try to remember how to do all this. Okay, so we'll pull this up and then we will start slideshow. Just gotta move all these other things out of my way. Slideshow, play from start. Okay, so hopefully you can all see that. If you can't, Darren, you let me know if there's any issues.
All good.
Wonderful. All right, so today's symposium is on globalization in the era of global change. And let's see why I won't let me continue. I guess I'll use this button. The round table, I was going to close these screens. There we go. And the roundtable topics today were, we were asked to talk about resource extraction, the transition to green energy, the socio-political and environmental complexities, as well as, resource extraction and its impact on health. So I'm going to try and do a bit of a global overview and survey of everything, just to kind of give everybody a sense of where we're at and to kind of create a context for the conversation. So let me begin with who am I? So my name is Dr. Gabrielle Slowey. I've been working with Indigenous communities since the late 90s. My first job out of my master's, so I was doing my master's in New Brunswick, working with communities there. And I was hired by the Mikisew Cree First Nation of Fort Chip, Alberta, to be their self-government officer. And this is back in the 90s when no one was talking about really self-government, or it was just sort of starting post, constitutional change. And for those of you who don't know, Fort Chipewyan is the most remote northern community in northern Alberta. So if you look at the oil sands here just north of Fort McMurray, and you see Wood Buffalo National Park, you'll see the Lake Athabasca there, the Athabasca Delta. And so Fort Chip just sits in that region. And so when I went up there, it was the 90s. Mikisew had just settled its treaty land entitlement. They were looking for opportunities, and Syncrude was coming online. Syncrude and Sunkar were just sort of gearing up our operations. They'd sort of developed new technologies, and were looking to partner and work with First Nations. And at the time, there was a sense that the government was the real tool of oppression, that they were, the Indian Act and other mechanisms like that were really impeding First Nations sort of economic development. So there was a sense that the marketplace was going to be more colorblind and would allow for more opportunities for First Nations to participate. And surely Syncrude did do a lot of working with the community. You probably have heard of the very, successful businessman, Dave Tuckerow. He was a member of the Mikisew Cree, the Boulanger Group, as well as another good example. And so there was a lot of optimism about the opportunities that would come along with development taking place so close to the communities. And the next slide, ignore the rest. This is back in the day before cell phone, so I had to use old camera. But if you look at the bottom here on the right, the reason I'm showing you this picture is to show you basically the main town of Fort Chip. So Fort Chip's a very small hamlet. There are 3 First Nations: Mikisew, the Athabasca, Chipdene, and then of course the Métis. And so the community, as you see in the bottom right, you see the church, the former priest house, the residential school would be on the right. And it's, as you clearly see, it sits on the delta, right? It's very much part of the Athabasca Delta, and that's part of the main livelihood, or was when we were all living up there in the 90s. And so, like I was saying, there was sort of this sense of excitement about what development could mean for the community. So, in 2000, it's not the profits that we're gaining for First Nations, it's seeing the positive changes that occur when our people, within our people, as they pursue a better way of life, which comes from steady employment, financial success, independence, and increased self-esteem. And that's from the 2000 plus Ed Couture. So these were sort of the hopes and dreams in the early 2000s. And I went on, as Darren politely mentioned, to write my book about this, because at the time, everyone was like, globalization's bad for labor, globalization's bad for the state, globalization's bad for gender. And I was sitting there living in Chip going, well, no one's asking First Nation communities, what does this mean to them? And so this was, looking at a community near a resource project, how was this impacting their governance? Now, fast forward a few years and things begin to change. The reason I put this slide up is simply to let you know that for every 1 barrel of oil requires 4 barrels of water, or up to 4 barrels of water. So where does this water come from? It comes from the Athabasca Delta. They require fresh water in order to extract the sand from the bitumen in order to produce barrels of oil. So what has happened? Well, one of the things that sort of started to become apparent in the aftermath, or especially as production started to ramp up, we started to see an increasing amount of production and output, was the increasing use of water. And this had a direct impact on the region. So this is sort of a view of the Fort Chip area. And so you can see where the waters have receded. And this has a lot of implications for people living in the community, simply things like trying to go out on the water and, having to go further ashore, just, more deadheads in the water and so forth. So just safety and boating and so forth. But there was more than just that. When I was up there, there was a thriving fish industry. And so one of the things that we immediately noticed was there started to be issues with the fish. And it was thankful to Dr. Schindler from University of Alberta and his team, who conducted a number of studies on the fish in the area and on the wildlife. And they came out with a public report saying that, there was concern about the, downstream impacts of the tailing ponds or whatever of Syncrude and their impact on the fish. And unfortunately, he was very much silenced, as was his research team, and he was not met with public support. And unfortunately, just as a bit of light humor for the morning, I always, not to make light of things, but makes me think of Blinky, the fish from Springfield that people kind of made fun of, during the Simpsons episodes. But seeing this in real life now makes us realize that some of these predictions on these shows are actually coming true. So the other thing that we noticed in the region when I lived up there, muskrat was a real delicacy. Everybody would eat it and enjoy it. It was something that people would go out and get, and all of a sudden they started to disappear. There were suddenly no more muskrat in the region. So started to see a real impact on sustainability, on the ability to harvest local animals, and of course on the local diet. And this is actually a picture I took in Tuktoyaktuk, but one of the things, the last time I was in Chip, they were building a water park. And I was like, oh, that's great, they're building a water park. I'm like, well, wait a second, why are they building a water park? And it's because when I lived up there, we could all go swimming, but now it wasn't really safe to swim up there. Also, I noticed everybody had water, like bottled water in their homes. They no longer drank out of the tap, so that the water contamination has become an issue. So things that weren't understood or anticipated in the early days started to change over time. And of course, one of the most important things that happened was, and this is Chief Alan Adam on the right and George Putcher on the left and Dr. John O'Connor in the middle. Dr. John O'Connor, so most of you probably are aware that most northern communities don't have doctors. They may have a nursing station if they're lucky. And Dr. John O'Connor went up there and he started to raise the alarm about an unusual high amount of cancer being experienced by community members, and not just cancer, but rare types of cancers, and affecting a lot of youth in particular. And so he kind of tried to make this correlation between the extraction going on and the impact on human health. And once again, sort of like Dr. Schindler, he was very much investigated by the College of Surgeons and Physicians for raising undue alarm, and very much made out to be a sort of scapegoat for creating a situation, or suggesting that there was a correlation. And this, though, was really a transformational point in the community where they really began to question a lot of what was going on just to the south of them, especially as the expansion of the tar sands was reaching further and further north. But what's interesting is, to put this all into global context, is Fort Chip's reason for Fort Chip became a settler colony through the Hudson Bay Company. So it was a Hudson Bay outpost in the early days. And one of the things I think most Canadians don't continue to remember is that Canada's raison d'etre is that fur was a fashion in Europe. And, you know, these two, de Radisson and Groyer, came over to explore and look for fur. And basically, Canada was a fur trading outpost for Europe long before it became a country. So resource extraction in many ways has been the raison d'etre for Canada to exist. And so when we think about this, you know, the famous political economist historian Harold Innis wrote a book about this called The Fur Trade in Canada. And he made this theory that the export of natural resources, or what he called staples, from Canada to more advanced economies had the pervasive impact on the economy and social and political systems. And this ultimately explains the way and the reasons the way Canada is the way it is today. So it explains the development of Canada over time. So I like to tell my students, to put it simply, if you can dig it, mine it, cut it, log it, fish it, take it out of the ground, take it out of the water, we will give it to you. That is sort of Canada's nuts and bolts, if you will. So while most of the world looks at Canada and sees, you know, hockey players or moose or RCMP, you know, and that's the sort of mythology that Canada sort of exists in. The reality is Canada's third in the world for crude oil reserves, the sixth largest oil producer, second in the world for hydroelectricity generation, second for uranium, and third in natural gas production. And now Canada is moving into the critical mineral industry. So as we know, Canada's produced a critical mineral strategy identifying 31 minerals. Excuse me, I'll stop some water here. That it's prioritizing, trying to make Canada sort of a leader in this area, given, you know, geosecurity issues, China and the critical mineral strategies and exports. And so there's a real sort of new support and impetus, if you will, for new mines. So the logic here is that as the need for these new minerals comes online, as we go through this sort of green transition, that new mines are going to be needed to develop and extract the minerals for the new technology and this technological evolution that's occurring. You know, in Ontario alone, they've announced some new EV battery plants, you know, Volkswagen, I believe Honda as well. But a lot of people are criticizing that we're building these plants when we haven't even got the minerals out of the ground yet. And to that end, one of the concerns is, how are they going to be mined? How are these minerals going to be brought out of the ground? Is it going to be simply the idea of extracting natural resources in a traditional way, as opposed to coming up with new ways of doing it? So are we mining a green economy, or as some authors suggest, are we simply shifting and greenwashing an existing mining energy, a mining economy? This is this article I was just referencing to. Is this sort of a critical mineral strategy, a green shift or greenwashing? And this is done by Thierry Rodin and Sophie Theriot. And they suggest that switching the energy source rather than challenging the prevailing modes of production and consumption has more to do with marketing and market positioning and geopolitics than it does with the mining strategy per se. So one of the concerns that these authors raise, and very rightly so, is that Indigenous and Northern communities are going to bear the long-lasting ecological, social, and cultural impacts of mining, and that this cannot be ignored. So clearly, we are very aware in Canada of the impact and the resistance to increasing development occurring in Indigenous lands. Now, this is a very important part of the picture, but it isn't the entire picture. And I'm very mindful of this. And there, at the same time that there's concern about the way mining is happening in territories, at the same time, it's not either or. It's not we either want mining or we don't want mining. And a recent study came out of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute that actually looked at Indigenous support for development. And I'm very mindful that in my experience, this has been the case that some communities, and even within the community, it may be we are okay with development happening in this area, but not in this area for spiritual reasons or traditional reasons. And a lot of communities are coming up with their own land use plans in order to decide what is important to them. And to that extent, you know, the Macdonald-Laurier study did an environics poll to say to community, you know, do you support or oppose? And you can see that, I mean, I feel like this is a bit misleading because we don't know what about resource development do they oppose. And so this is actually the next slide, interestingly enough, is one I took off. It was on a wall in Fort Chip. I was walking around Fort Chip and there was in the multiplex, this happened to be just posted. And so I just took a picture of it. And basically, you know, they had asked community members, like, what were their key concerns? And you can see from this that the environment, and then business development, and then culture, education, training, health, social issues, employment, infrastructure. So that they themselves are having these conversations about, well, what is it that they want to prioritize as a community? And similarly, in that study I referenced by Macdonald-Laurier, they also did their own questionnaire and asked what was important to communities. And they said things like better access to health, job opportunities, education. So similar themes, culture, governance, and so forth. One of the main takeaways I'd want to leave you with today going forward is that regardless of whether or not there's minerals or there aren't minerals, one of the most important things that's changing the landscape is the duty to consult. The Crown has a duty to consult. It is no longer acceptable for companies to go to the province and get a permit to start developing without first consulting the Indigenous communities that have a potential to be affected. And the old days of just going in, issuing licenses and giving it to mining companies is gone. Communities, the government has a duty to consult. And what is this? That's Chief Coudray, by the way, from Fort Chip, who unfortunately has passed away. So the duty to consult arises when the Crown has a real or constructive knowledge of the potential existence of an Aboriginal right or title, and the Crown contemplates conduct that might adversely affect that Aboriginal right or title. And consultation after the fact does not satisfy the duty. It must occur prior to the proposed activities. So these court rulings have really tried to shift the landscape in terms of making sure Indigenous communities are part of the conversations before any shovels ever hit the ground. And of course, this is further bolstered by things like the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and free and prior informed consent. So FPIC is free and prior informed consent. So free, that they make it on their own choice, prior in advance, informed, they understand what's going to happen, and then they give their consent. And these topics are particularly, I'm winding down now, these topics are particularly timely. As we all know, as I kind of alluded to earlier, Ontario is currently in the midst of developing and preparing for the Ring of Fire area, which is rich in chromite. Doug Ford, as a premier, has announced, his support, that he said he'll drive the tobaccos if he has to. And what's interesting in this scenario is we're seeing some communities like Neskantaga being very much opposed to the development, but other communities like Martin Falls are excited about the idea of having a road. You've got to remember, a lot of these communities are fly in, fly out. There's no year-round access or roads. So freight, a lot of things are very expensive. So when we think about resource development, a lot of people don't immediately think, oh, I'll get a road. This is exciting. People think jobs, people think maybe healthcare, but a road can also be a lifeline for many communities. So in this situation, we see some communities being in support because they're going to get a road, and other communities being not so in support. But one last dynamic I want to throw into this conversation just before we wrap up, and this sort of alludes to the Martin Falls, is what happens when communities themselves take over the projects? When the communities become the drivers of these projects and the owners of these projects. And what's really interesting is in Fort Chip, the three nations have come together to form a new company called Three Nations Energy, which is Indigenous owned, community driven, and focused on clean energy projects. And so just to give you a quote from Chief Alan Adam, we are already seeing the impacts of climate change on the Peace Athabasca Delta. Yes, our nations are dependent for jobs and investment revenues on the prosperity of the oil sands. But that doesn't mean forcing us into a false choice between a strong fossil fuel industry and protecting climate and the environment. We can do both. It all starts with what we do here at home, cleaning up our own emissions like the solar farm will do for electricity in Fort Chip. And to their end, thankfully, a lot of companies are starting to recognize they have to work with First Nations. So the chief of ATCO says this outstanding project showcases how industry and communities can work together to develop sustainable and renewable energy solutions that will benefit today's and future generations. Partnering with communities in a meaningful economic way is something we take very seriously. Together with 3NE, we are fostering community ownership and self-sustaining economic development through job creation, investment in infrastructure, and revenue from the sale of clean power. So we see not only are communities taking the lead in many cases, we see industry is starting to listen, and even there's some hope that Ottawa is starting to listen. I found this article from a Senator Wells that the federal government needs to listen when First Nations want development, whether that be, traditional development or these new minerals. So just to wrap up, I'm seeing running out of time. What are my concluding thoughts here? What are the costs of development and what factors are driving Indigenous responses? Well, we have to remember there's no singular Indigenous experience with development. There are and the other thing we have to remember is the experience with resource extraction is not evenly experienced across Canada. Not every community has this opportunity. And for many communities, they see resources as a real opportunity. At the same time, support once granted is not guaranteed. Meaning we have to be mindful that things change, and communities have to be aware that that too can change. I mean, the geopolitical climate and so forth. And we have to be mindful as well that some communities, for them, a resource extraction opportunity looks like a windfall because suddenly they feel that they're going to be, have all these opportunities. For others, it's exactly what they don't want. They don't want that. So we have to, be mindful of the impacts of extraction on health, and think about what does community well-being mean for the community. But I guess my final takeaway was, at the end of the day, I was taught in community that we have 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason, that we should listen and speak less. And I'm very questionable and thinking through this, critical mineral strategy. How many Indigenous leaders were at the table in developing that strategy? How many voices are there, having these discussions in Ottawa or in the, mining communities? And so I would argue that Indigenous knowledge of the land and voices are still very largely absent in these conversations and in decision making about these about the role of critical minerals going forward. So on that note, I want to thank you for your time today. This is a picture of Old Crow in North Yukon at 11 a.m. in a February morning. So, thinking through what does this mean for communities, I look forward to hearing from the other panelists. I know we have a very exciting agenda ahead of us, and I want to thank you today for your time and for listening to me. I wish you a good morning.
Thank you very much, Dr. Slowey, for that excellent presentation. I think it really provided a great overview and highlighted the multifarious nature of the issues that we're going to be discussing today. Thank you.